Welcome back, people. You already know it's me, Bryce from Develop Mindfully, and let's continue writing our CSV to map web app. So just to recap on where we left off last time, we had just finished our select field section as well as the geocoding process for converting the addresses in our data into coordinates. So now we're ready to actually create our map and build our interface for creating routes between map markers. Now, back in our main index.js file, we left off defining the callback of our geocode function. We have a few more actions to take here before we navigate to the plan route section of our map. But firstly, we want to actually create the map, plot the markers on it, as well as initializing event listeners for creating routes and generating the directions. So let's turn to our interactions folder. We're going to create a new file called map.js. And in here, we're going to start by importing jQuery. Here we are. And we're also going to import our retrieve and store functions from local storage. And our function is going to be called create map. So we're going to start by just retrieving our data. So retrieve data, store that in a constant called data. Then we're also going to define some map options, and these are basically just some configurations for our map in the form of an object. So we're going to give the map type control false. This will disable the control that lets you switch between like satellite, street view, things like that. Rotate control, we're going to turn that off as well. And we're going to set our zoom to 11. Keep it nice and zoomed out for us. Now we're going to define an array that will hold our markers. This will be an empty array to start. And we're also going to instantiate a lat-lang bounds object. This looks like if I access, so google.maps.lat-lang bounds. And this bounds object represents the coordinates that are aligned with the rectangle that our map occupies. I'll explain that more as we actually plot things on our map. And then we want to actually instantiate our map object. So new.google.maps map. And we're going to pass in the container element. So we're going to use document get element by ID to actually retrieve that, passing in map. And we're also going to pass in our map options for how we want to configure our map. And next, we want to actually loop over our data, and we're going to use that using for each, passing in the each data object as well as the index of the object. And within our loop, we want to create a new marker object. Passing in our map, a title, which will be the address string attribute, and finally the position, which is the lat-lang attribute of our data, and that's what we defined earlier in our geocoding process. So create a new marker, passing in our map, as I said. The title will be the address string within our data object, and then the position will be the lat-lang attribute. And with our new marker instantiated, we're going to push this reference onto our array of markers. So markers.push, and we're going to push m onto that. And then we're also going to take our bounds object and call the extend method with the lat-lang object. The lat-lang object. So what this does, this will ensure that the rectangular bounds around the map will also contain this location. So if we have a bunch of markers, we don't want any of them to fall outside of like the map's viewport. So this will easily take care of that for us. All right. And after creating all of our markers, we will call the our map object actually has a fit bounds method on it, and we're going to pass in our bounds to make sure that the map is adjusted to contain all of our markers. And then finally, we're also just going to return the reference to our map object in case we want to access the map from the point where the function is called. Now we're going to take a look and see what that map looks like in just a minute, but we're going to switch gears a bit first and write another function that we need to call directly after we finish geocoding back in our main index.js file. So there is a button in the plan route section for exporting and downloading the JSON data associated with the map. So as we were creating and populating the map immediately after geocoding, we want the data export to be immediately available as well. So we're going to create a new folder under our JS folder called export. And within there, we're going to pass in a new file called json.js. And we also need to create a date utility. So under our utils folder, we're going to create a new file called data.js. And we'll define this one first. So we're going to create a function called date as year, month, day in the string format. So this function is basically just going to return a hyphenated date as a string. So to do this, we're going to first grab the current date and store it in a variable. And then we're going to also call the toIsoString method on the date. And what this does, it'll get it into a nice format that has those hyphens already kind of built in. It's a standardized format. And we're going to split this string at the T character. So just to give you an example of what one of these dates looks like, looks something like this. So we only want this first portion here, the hyphenated date part of it. We don't really care about the time in this case, so we just want to actually split the string at this T character. So we can easily do that by, once we call this toIsoString method, we're going to chain our split method to that. We're going to split on the T character. And this is going to return to us an array. So the array is going to hold both parts of the string where it was split. So this will be the first part, and then the second part will be everything that comes afterwards. So we're just going to actually take the first portion of the string. So we're going to just call the use the 0th element of the array. And there we go. We'll have a nice date that is just the year, month, and day separated by hyphens. So moving on to our json.js file. First we're going to import jQuery again. And we're also going to need our retrieve function from utils storage. And we're going to import this function that we just wrote, date as year, month, and day from our utils date file. Right, and we're going to create a function called export const. Oh, sorry. The function will be called embed JSON data. So we're going to create a variable which will kind of define the format for our JSON data that we'd like to export. So we're going to set this like this, and we're going to have two fields within there. It's going to be data and then also route. So the data we will grab directly from local storage, as we have been, and we're going to do the same thing for our route. So we're going to retrieve that from local storage. So this will include the so the data that's already been geocoded, so it can be easily brought back into the map and just plotted directly, and then also the route, which will come from our directions that we get to a little bit later. And so now we want to actually encode the data in a URI. So the way we're going to do that is using JavaScript's encode URI component method. And we're going to pass in the stringified version of the data. So our JSON, right? Our JSON variable that we define there. And this is just going to basically escape the string and keep it in a URL friendly format. And we're going to actually put that into our JSON button, which is really an anchor tag, so it's like a hyperlink. So to do this, we're going to select that button. So it has an ID of export JSON button. And we're going to put a attribute of download on this hyperlink. And then we're going to give it a title for the file. So it's going to be map. We're just going to say map data, and then using our template literal here, we're going to inject our, going to call our date method. So that's just going to get us the current date in that nice hyphenated format that we defined before, and we want to make sure this is a JSON file, so we're going to add that file type to the end. And finally, we also just need to select it again, this time putting a different attribute. It's going to be actually the href attribute, where we'll actually embed the data. So I'm going to select the attribute href, and for the value, I'm going to use this string, the specific string where we're going to specify the MIME type. So text/JSON. We're going to also define the character set, which would be UTF-8. And finally, we'll put our encoded JSON easily using the template literals once again. Great. So with that done, let's return to our main index.js file and go to the callback of our geocode function. So we're going to initialize a variable called route in our local storage and set it to be an empty array. And next we're going to call our create map function, which will auto import thanks to VS Code. And then we're also going to call our embed JSON data function. And finally, we will call our navigation function to actually go to the plan route section. So if we go to take a look now what that looks like, click on our get started, going to open our CSV file, and now we're going to specify our geocoding fields like so. We'll leave those on. I'm going to click plot. And as you can see, our geocoding process is taking place. And there we are. Our map is generated, and we added our markers to the map. So our map looks good, but now we want to actually add our Directions API functionality and some event listeners to interact with the map. So let's go back to our create map.js file. So first, we're going to instantiate a directions renderer object. I'm going to get that from Google Maps directions renderer. Oh, sorry. And we're also going to pass in this option of preserve viewport set to true. We don't want anything to be resized when we're doing our directions. And then we're going to also add a listener, an event listener function to our to a particular Directions API event. So it's called directions changed. You can look up for a full list of all the different events that are associated with Google Maps and their documentation. We're going to pass a function called handle directions changed, and we'll quickly define that function down here. Well, we're just going to define actually the shell of the function, and we will follow up with that later. And then finally, we're going to call the set map function on the directions renderer to actually pass the reference to our map and link the two together. Great, we will save that, and now we're going to go down back into our loop where we're initializing our markers, and we're going to add some different event listeners to the markers as well. So we're going to add a listener for the mouse over event. And the reason we're doing this, when we hover our mouse over top of a marker, we want to reveal some information about the location and also the data associated with that location. So what we're going to do is we're going to display the address on the one side, and we're going to show the data in another pre-tag on the other side. So we're going to select the location pre-tag. And we're going to set the text to be a JSON stringified version of the address string, or sorry, the address object actually. So it'll come out in a JSON format. We can see kind of each portion of the address. And this is also going to take another argument, null, for the callback that would transform the string. We don't need to specify that, but we do want to provide 2 spaces in between to create some line break characters and things to format that JSON string nicely for us, and it'll stay in its format because we're using a pre-tag, which will make it look pretty as you would expect JSON to look. So, and then we're going to select also our data pre-tag to on the right side of the location data. We want to just associate any data associated. Sorry, on the right side of the address, we want to show any data associated with that location. So we're going to do the same thing, but this time on the data, passing in null again, and to create some white space and some new line breaks to display that JSON information in like a tabbed format. Now we also want to define another listener for our mouse out event. So this is when we actually take our mouse off of a marker. And it's just basically going to undo the action that we just did. So it's going to select the location pre and just set the text back to our default message of no location to show. And we'll do the same for our data pre-tag. I'm going to set the text to no data to show. Great, and we're just going to add one more listener. So this time it'll be for the click event, which will make some actions take place. And just to define what we're kind of expecting here, the idea is as we click on our markers consecutively, we want them to be joined together to form a route, and that will also generate the directions between each stop. So before we can get there, we first need to define a function for adding a new marker location to our route. So we're going to call this function push route location, and it's going to take an index as a argument. So this is meaning the position in our array of location data. So first we're going to retrieve our route from our local storage, and if nothing is found for the route, we're going to initialize it to be an empty array. It should already be an empty array based on where we defined it in our index file over here when we initialized it, but just in case, it's always a good practice to initialize it to the empty array that we would expect if it happens to be null. And then we're going to push onto this array the index of that we pass in, and then we're going to update the route in our local storage. And now we need to actually write our function to make the request to the directions service and render the directions in our map. So we're going to call this render directions, and this is going to accept the reference to the directions renderer and map objects as arguments. And we're also going to retrieve our our route from local storage. And we're also going to add a condition that checks if the route is null or if the route has one or fewer stops. So route.length is less than or equal to 1. And if that's the case, we want to remove the directions from our map, because we want to well, if it's null, they just don't exist. Like, we have no stops that are added, and then also we don't actually display the route until we have at least 2 stops, a start and a finish. So to do this, we're going to set the you'd call the setMap method on the directions renderer and set it to null. Now next, we're going to retrieve our data, as we're going to have to loop over it. Right, and then we're going to set our directions renderer. We're going to call it the set link together our directions renderer and our map. And now we're going to create a new array that will hold our waypoints, which are the stops that are between the first and the last stop. And we will need to send these to the direction service under the name waypoints, and they require a specific format. So we're going to create an empty array to hold those waypoints. We're going to loop over our route. We're going to loop over our stops, really. And for each index in that array, and then also the current position in the array. So in here, so again, the waypoints are the stops between the first and the last stop. So the way we're going to do that is add a condition here. And we only want to push a new waypoint if the stop is not the first and not the last. So the way we would check that is using this I variable here, which is the current it's the current position within the route array. We're going to say if it does not equal 0, if it's not the first, and if I is not the last. So the last would be the length of our array minus 1. That would be the last index, sorry, that would be the index of the last element, right? So if it's not, in that case, then we want to add that location to our array of waypoints. So we're going to push this object here, and it has to be this format just based on what the API defines. So we have, we're going to pass in our location, which will be our lat lang. So we're going to grab from our data array the index of the item which is existing in our route. So we're going to pass in index and grab the lat lang of that data. And we're also going to set stop over to true. So now we're going to initialize an instance of our directions service object. So we're going to do that by google.maps.directions service. And we're going to call the route method on this object. And this is going to accept, firstly, a JSON object of parameters for the route, and it will also take a callback, which will provide us with the results and status of the directions request. So in our object, so first of all, we're going to provide the origin, so that's kind of the starting point of our route. And the way we're going to do that is by taking our, using our data, which is all of our locations, we're going to use as the index the first position in our route, because this route array, again, contains indexes of the data array. So that's going to be our starting point. And we're going to grab the actual coordinates, so the lat lang object there. We're going to do the same thing for the destination, which is the stopping point of our route. So it's going to be the very last element in our route array. This is a little confusing, but if you look at it, if we break it down slowly, we're going to grab, so route.length minus 1, again, is the index of our last element in the array. So we're going to grab the index using the route, since it's held in this route array, and that will be referenced in our data. So grabbing that very last stop in our route, and then also calling the grabbing the location of that data. And then we're going to pass in the waypoints, and as I said, these are the all the points between the start and the finish that we want to route our directions around. And then we're going to set this field down here, optimize waypoints, set to true. And what this does is it allows the directions service to rearrange the order of the waypoints to provide the fastest route. So that's actually something we definitely want. If there was one that was way out of the way, it would take far longer, and if we just rearrange things a little to save some time, then that's definitely something we want to do in this case. And then we're also going to set the travel mode here to driving, just for the sake of assumption. So now in our callback, for when we actually retrieve the results of the request, we're basically going to check, first of all, if the status is equal to this string OK, we want to using our directions renderer, we want to set directions, and we want to pass in the results. Fantastic. So now we have our directions nicely integrated into our map, and now moving back up to our marker listeners, we want to make use of this when we click on our stops or our markers. So we're going to call our push route location function first, and that's going to actually push a new, so it's going to grab I, which comes from here. It's going to be the index in our data array to push onto our route array. And then we're going to call our render directions method, passing in our references to the directions renderer and also the map. Now we're almost done. The last thing we need to do is hide the markers that show up on our route, but only if that route appears on screen, which is when there are 2 or more stops, meaning a start point and a finish point. And the reason we do this is because the rendering of the directions puts its own markers on screen. So we don't want those initial markers to overlap with the ones with the letter labels that come from the directions being shown. So first we're going to retrieve our route from local storage to get the latest version of it. And we're going to say if the route is 2 or more stops long, then we want to filter our markers for the ones that are actually referenced in the route. So the way we do this is calling the filter function on our array. And we're going to use our route array to see if it includes the index of this marker. Oh, sorry, includes. So now that we have the set of those markers that are used in the route, we're going to loop over those using for each. And for each of these markers, we're going to just call the set map method and set it to null. And what this will do is actually remove it from our map. So if I save this, now we can take a look at our map. Alright, and now you can see our mouse over working. So when we mouse over a location, we can see the selected location and then also the selected data for that location. And now if we click between, we can see our directions start to form. Very cool. Now let's see if I click this one that's nearby, you can see how the order sort of changed. And that was that optimized waypoints that it was talking about. So we still hit all of our stops, but it's going to calculate the quickest way that we can get between all of them, save as much time as possible. Great. So now let's say we want to scrap the route that we just created. Some sort of reset button to remove this would come in handy. So let's add that button in our map, or in Google Maps terms, it's called a control. So switching back to our code, we want to create a function that will actually create the HTML that makes up our control. So this function is going to be called create reset control. It's going to accept a parent div element as an argument, which we will use to append our control. So we're going to start by creating a div element. So document create element div, and then we're going to give it a class of map button. And remember, these are corresponding to the styles that we created earlier. We're also going to give this control a title attribute so that if the user hovers over top of it, they can get that little title pop up in the browser. And we're going to say click to reset route, just a simple little instruction there. And then for our parent div, we want to append this control. So we're going to pass in reset control, append to the parent div. So now, next we're going to create a div that will actually contain our button's text. So we'll create another div, and we'll store it in, another div. We're going to store it in a variable called reset text. And we're going to give this a class name of map button text. And then we're also going to set the inner HTML of this div to be reset route. Finally, we're going to append this text to our reset control. So we're going to use reset control, append child, passing in reset text. And then lastly, we need to actually attach the click event listener to the control. So for reset control, we're going to add an event listener. For the click event, we're going to give a callback here. And so as we said, we want to take actions to reset our route. So the first thing we're going to do in order to do this is clear it out from our local storage. So for our route entry in local storage, we're going to reset that to an empty array. And then we need to update the JSON that's found in our export JSON buttons. So we're going to call our embed JSON data function here. And then we're also going to call our create map function, which maybe looks a little confusing showing up here, but the reason we're doing this is because it'll easily revert our map back to how we initialized it, wiping away any route that was made and making sure all of our markers that are supposed to be there are there. And then finally, we also need to remove any stops that are shown in the location table. Now, we haven't actually defined those the actions where we append new rows to that location table, but we'll get to that shortly. So really all we need to do is actually clear the HTML that's in that location. And then we're going to add a default row that just says no directions to show. So we're going to do this by first creating a TD element. So we're going to use jQuery this time. I'm going to select the raw HTML for the TD element. We're going to give it a call span of 3. Our table has 3 columns. And so when we do this, oh, sorry, that should be in brackets, in quotes. And we're going to set the text within here to no directions to show. Then we're also going to create a row element here that we need to select again the raw HTML. And we're going to append our TD element to this. So we're also going to clear out any anything in the location table body that was there previously. So we can easily do that using the HTML method with jQuery and just set it to an empty string. That'll get rid of it. And then we're going to append this new row that has our this default message in it, just to show the user that there isn't actually any stops in the route. Great. And now we need to return to our create map function and actually add the control to our map. So we're going to go back up here. So now first we're going to create a new dev to contain our reset control. So we're going to store it in a reference called reset control. We're going to create element div. And then we're going to call that function that we just defined, create reset control, passing in this parent div as the one to append our control to. Then we're going to give the reset control an index of 1, just to make sure that it appears over top of our map. And then finally, the most important step, you're going to use the controls array that's actually attached to our map, and we're going to reference the top left control position. And this comes from a constant in the Google Maps API. So maps.controlPosition, and we're going to select the top left. And we're going to push onto this array the reference to our control using reset control. And there we are. And we're almost done. The last thing we need to do is circle back to our handle directions changed function, and that's going to control the steps that will, sorry, it's defined up here, And that's going to control what the steps we take every time that we add a new stop to our route. And that's going to include adding entries to that location table that I was referring to earlier. So we're going to come to where that's defined right here. The first thing we're going to do is we want to actually retrieve the route from our local storage. And we're also going to retrieve our data as well. And we're also going to so every time that we add a new stop to our array, we also want to, since the route is contained in the JSON that we want to export, we will also want to update the JSON data that's embedded in our export button so that it's always the latest version of whatever we're doing. So we're going to call our embed JSON data function. And now we're going to actually update the location table body. So as we did before, we're going to clear out anything that was there previously. So we're going to do that by selecting it, calling the HTML method, and passing it an empty string that'll clear everything out. And now we're going to loop over every stop in our route using the index from there. And we're going to define in our callback, we want to create a new table row, and we're going to do that with jQuery. So we're going to use the raw HTML. And you'll notice that as we click markers and add stops to our route, each stop is labeled by a letter. So in the first column of our table, we want to display that letter, but we need to actually pull those from somewhere. So let's create a new file under our utils, and we're going to call that, just want to close that. So we're going to create a new file under utils. We're going to call that array.js. And I'm just going to copy and paste this in because it's just a long array of the alphabet. So it's going to look like this. So it's just a constant holding all of the alphabet in an array, and it's exported. So we can import that here. So we're going to go to the top here. So we're going to import alphabet from utils/array. Now going down back to our loop here. So we're going to create a new column element, or a TD tag. I'm going to do the same thing, selecting the raw HTML. We're going to add a scope attribute here of row, since this column is kind of the label for the row. And then the text within that, we're going to supply the our reference to our alphabet array, and we're going to use the just the I here for the current position in the array to grab that element. Now in the next column, we want to just place the formatted address of our stop. So we can create a TD element, and we're going to set the text to be so from our data array, we want to grab the index of the current stop in our route. So we're going to use the index to reference that element, and then we're going to use the address string in there. And now in our last column, we want to show the stringified JSON data that's associated with that location. And to do this, we're going to need a utility to show our JSON as formatted, readable text. So we're going to, in string.js here, we're going to create a new function, and it's just going to be called JSON as text. That will accept some JSON as an argument. We're going to say let text equal to a stringified version, and we're going to pass in null for the function, and we don't, could be just because we don't need to take any action for changing the transform process. And then we pass in 1 for the space argument, which will introduce like one white space character between each part of the string. And then the other thing we want to do is actually remove any new line and carriage return characters, since we want the JSON data to just show up all in one line. So the way we do this is using the string replace method. And we're going to grab every new line character and just get rid of it by putting an empty string. I'm just going to repeat this here for the carriage return characters as well. And then finally, we will return the text. Easy enough. So now switching back to our map.js file, I'm just going to import that function for us. Utils string. Going back down to where we were appending to our tables. So we're going to create that final column using another TD tag. And then we're just going to set the text of that last column to be, so using our JSON as text, we're going to pass in the data. So grabbing it the same way, we have the index of the current stop in our route. So we reference that in our data array. And we grab the data this time. So then, of course, we need to append each column to our row element. So using our tr element, we're going to call append, passing in the first column, our first TD tag, and we're just going to repeat this for the second and third columns as well. And then finally, selecting our table body, location table body, we're going to append the final row, which contains all of our columns now. Alright, so that wraps up our directions changed handler. So if we save and refresh that, we can switch to our map, and we can see this in action. Alright, so now when we click on our elements, so not only do we have the route showing up on our map, but we also have things showing up in our table here as well. So we can see as we add new things, we can add to the table, and also we have our handy reset route button here. So if we click that, it's just going to refresh our map, reset it back to what it was, and clear out that table for us. Nice, this is really coming together. So we really only have two major features left to implement. So the first being our JSON import feature, which is back a couple of steps, and after that we also have our PDF export. So we're going to start by getting that import JSON right. So this is in the case where we exported our JSON data from another map session, and we want to skip the select fields and the geocoding steps and get right back to our map, including any route that we might have created. So now if I click on our export JSON button, we can see it downloaded here, and we can have a look at what this looks like. So we can see here, and I'm just going to format this for us quickly. Oh, and I don't actually have one. But really all we have here is kind of two sets of information. We have our data array, and then somewhere down the line we also have our route array, as we defined in our function to embed the JSON in our button for download. So to begin our import process for a file like this, we have to return to our import section. So if I go to our main index.js file, we have this change listener here that we left empty on our JSON file input. So as we did for our CSV file, we need to define a JSON file handler as well. So we're going to go to our import. Here, we're just going to close some of these files here. We're going to go to our import file here, and we're going to define a JSON or handle JSON file change function. It's going to take in files and a callback. So just to recap kind of on the steps here, very similar to what we have above with the CSV file. So we're going to check, first of all, I'm even just going to copy and paste it. It's that similar. So we're going to check if the files, if there isn't at least one file, we're going to just return a callback and reset the file input back to its default message. for the label, and if otherwise, we're going to grab the first file, and then we're going to do some checking on the file. So I'll copy and paste this again. I'm going to do some verification on just the file type and what we're looking at. So if the file type is not application/JSON, or if the name does not include .json, then we can assume it's not the right file type that we're looking for. So we're going to return the callback with another message in the error portion of the callback that says invalid file type must be a JSON file. And then finally, we're going to do a very similar workflow with our file reader API. So we're going to instantiate a new file reader object. In the onload callback, we're going to call the one that we pass into our method. We're going to put null for error. We're going to supply it with the file name, but this time we're going to call our parse JSON function instead, using and passing in the result of reading the file. We're also going to have our onError attribute defined here, and then we're going to get the process started by reading the file as text, passing in the reference to our file. So we're going to save that, and switching back to our index.js now. In our change event listener, we want to call our new handler. So handle JSON file change, and we're going to pass in the files from this file input. And our callback again has an error, it has the file name, and it has the file contents. So this is also going to be handled quite similarly to the above. So first of all, we're just going to check if there's an error. So if there's an error, we want to return, but before returning and not continuing to take any more actions, we want to set the file label to the text of the error. And after we do that, we want to also, so within the contents of this file, remember we have in our exported JSON file, we have an attribute called data and an attribute called route. So we're going to store those now as the data and the route in our local storage. Just overwriting anything that's there and loading it in directly. And remember, it's already geocoded, we're already good to go. So it's just going to fill in those properties in our local storage for us. And then we're just going to do some manipulations to the UI here. So the JSON file label, we want to set the text to the file name. So we're going to put file : file, passing in the file name with the template literal. And we want to clear out, right, so similarly to what we did up here, if we select a CSV, we want to clear out the JSON file stuff. So I'm just going to copy and paste this just for simplicity. So if we select a JSON file, we want to clear out the CSV file label and the CSV file input. So clearing out the value, so if there's any file that was chosen, we want to just get rid of that, wipe it out, and we want to reset the label back to its default choose file message. And then finally, we want to make sure that our import button is no longer disabled. So we're going to, using the prop method, we're going to use disabled and set that to false. And you'll notice, oh yeah, right. So you'll notice that the difference, we in the CSV workflow, we define like the summary of the number of rows in our data and also the file name. We're actually going to be skipping, this is shown in the select field step. So since we're actually skipping that step, we don't need to update that. So even easier. And with our input change listener ready to read, parse and store our file, we just need to define actions for when the import button is clicked. So we did this already for the CSV workflow, so now we have this condition here for if it's a JSON file. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to the first thing we want to do is actually call our create map function. But instead of calling it on its own, we're actually going to call it within the render directions function. So remember, this function takes it takes a directions renderer reference. So new, typing Google keeps doing that. It keeps autofilling. It's really irritating. So we're going to create a new directions renderer, passing in preserve viewport set to true, and then it also accepts a map reference. So we're going to call create map actually here. So not only will this take all the actions that the create map does, it'll do all the initialization of our markers and do all that, but the function also returns a map reference. So it'll pass that reference back here, and then we can call, it will, the flow of execution will call render directions, passing in that reference and taking care of everything for us. So after we do that, we also want to call our handle directions changed function. So this will populate. So we took our file in. We have a route that could be defined within our JSON file. So we want to make sure, if there is a route, we want to update the table as well that's shown next to our map. So we want to make sure it's all populated. And then we're also going to call our embed JSON data function, because this is going to take the data in our local storage and make sure that the export JSON button is up to date. And finally, we want to call our navigation function. We have one specifically for this case. It's called skip to route section, and this is essentially just going to hide the import section and directly show the plan route section, skipping that whole select fields and geocoding step in the middle. So if we save this and we go back, just going to wait for that to refresh. Perfect. It's compiled. So we're going to this time choose a JSON file. So I'm just going to use a sample one here. We're going to click import. And there we are. We see that our table was all filled up, and we have our route plotted directly on the map. Awesome. Alright, so last but certainly not least, we want to be able to export a PDF report that summarizes the route that we planned. So just to give you a preview, it's going to look something like this. So you can see there's kind of like a table showing, it's kind of just a replication of the table that we have here, and then we have some interesting hyperlinks here with some directions. And these actually, if you click on them, we'll be able to open get some directions on your phone's Google Maps app if you were to save this to your phone. So really, like this, what we have here is pretty basic, but it could be fully customized to be whatever you like, and it's kind of just a quick introduction to how to use this JSPDF library, as well as working with the tables and creating things like hyperlinks. So if we go to the main route section of the route section of our main index.js file, we're going to start by selecting that export PDF button. We're going to define a empty click event listener, and we're going to pass in a function which we'll define now. So under our export folder, we're going to create a new file called pdf.js, and in here we're going to first import our JSPDF library, so from JSPDF, and then we're also going to import the AutoTable plugin, which we installed earlier with our npm packages. And then we're also going to need a few other utilities, as well as our retrieve function from local storage. I have them right here, so I'm just going to copy and paste them quickly. So we're going to be using our retrieve, we're going to use our alphabet again, and also our JSON as text function for creating just like a simple JSON string, and also our date as year, month, and day utility. And next we're going to want to define a couple of constants that we need. So first, it's going to be the margin size in pixels in the X direction, so meaning left to right. And then we're going to do the same for the margin in the Y direction, so meaning at the top and the bottom. And we're going to set that to be 20. So now our function is going to be called export PDF report. And we're going to start by, as usual, we're going to grab our data and also our route. So we're going to retrieve our data and retrieve our route. Then we're going to define a couple more constants, and these are going to be for the title and the file name of our PDF. So for the title, we're just going to set it to be report. We're using backtick, so we're going to use ES6 template literals here. We're going to call our date as year, month, and day method just to get that date stamped right in there. Then we're going to do the same thing similarly for the file name. So it's going to be report and then a hyphen. I'm going to put in, once again, that date and followed by the .pdf extension there. And now to actually start building our PDF, we need to instantiate the library. So we're going to store a reference in let PDF, and then we're going to say new JSPDF, and going to pass in a few arguments here. So first of all, for the orientation, we're going to pass in P for portrait. And then the next is going to be the unit, so the units for kind of moving around the page. And we're going to pass in PX for pixels. And then finally, we want the format of the paper, which we're going to put in a letter. So it's just going to be a simple US letter-sized piece of paper. And we're also going to set a property here for the PDF. So there's a full list of the properties that can be set for a PDF file in the JSPDF documentation, but we're just going to specify the title here. So it's just a property of the file, and it'll show up in a PDF reader like Adobe Acrobat. So we're going to set the properties there, passing in the shorthand form of our object, just passing in that title. So to quickly explain how this library works, we're essentially going to be placing items in the PDF by moving around it using X and Y coordinates. So we're going to initialize a variable called Y, and we're going to start at the margin point on the page. So if you kind of picture the page as a rectangle, we're going to be kind of, say this window of code is kind of my page. So we can start kind of at a point in the margin, and we're going to be, as we add to Y, we're going to be moving down the page, and that's going to be kind of the reference point where we can add a new item to the PDF. And the same thing will work in the X direction, moving from left to right. So if you can imagine, we're going to start like our current Y position, starting at that margin at the top, so starting 10 pixels from the top of the page. So the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to set the current font size on the PDF. So we're going to do that by calling the set font size function. We're going to pass in 16s because this is going to be our title, so we're going to make it a little larger. And then we're going to actually add some text to our PDF. So we're going to call the text method, and we're going to pass in, first of all, the so it's going to be just the same title that we defined here. So we'll pass in title as our text, and it's going to take X and Y coordinates. So we're going to pass in the margin X because that's where we want to start whenever we're moving from left to right. So we're going to start in margin X, and then we're going to do it in our current Y position, which is also just at the margin Y, 20 pixels from the top. All right. Now we need to now shift our Y, because now if you're imagining kind of what it looks like on the page, we want to move below the title and add some more text. It's going to be kind of our subtitle here. And so we're going to do that by adding to Y 20 pixels. And then we're also going to set the font size. So it's going to remember the last font size was 16. We're going to update that now to be 14, so a slightly smaller kind of subtitle. And then we're going to add some more text. And this time we're going to add the subtitle route. The X position is going to be the same. And then we're going to do the current Y position. So remember, it looks the same as we did here, but we did shift down by 20 pixels. So this route subtitle is going to show up nicely below the main title of our page. Alright, so now we want to create kind of a copy of the table that we see here on our web app. We want to create a copy of that in our PDF. So we're going to first define the table headings. So we're going to store those in a constant called table head. And now the jsPDF-autotable plugin is going to accept a head attribute, and it's kind of taking, so you're going to see this double array happening here. So it's going to be like an array of rows, and then each row has to be defined kind of in its own array here. So we want our headings to be location, followed by address, followed by data. So that's going to be the letter, so just kind of using the alphabet, the address of that location, and then any data associated with that location. And now we're going to also define the table body. So similarly, it's going to be an array of row arrays. So we're going to take our route and we're going to map that. You're going to create a new array. So we have our indexes here, which are stored on the route, and then the current position in the array. So we're going to return an array as well, right? Because we want to create the same structure here, where our table body is an array, but each element is in itself an array of entries which make up a single row. So in that single row, the first value is going to be the letter of the alphabet for the current position that we're in, and then we're going to pass in the address of the current stop. So we're going to take our reference to our data at the element of the index that we're at, and then we're going to grab the address string. And then finally, using our JSON as text function, we're going to pass in the same thing, grabbing the index of the current stop from our data array and grabbing the data attached to that. So we have our table head and our table body here. So now we can use our auto table plugin. So first of all, we're going to shift down the Y again. Whenever, see, this is kind of an important step whenever you don't want anything to overlap on the page, because it will if you don't move the Y coordinate down, excuse me. And so we're going to also change the font size. We want to make it even smaller now, so we're going to set the font size to be 12 pixels. And then we're going to call our auto table plugin. So we're going to call PDF.autotable. It's going to take an object with some parameters for how to set this up. So the start Y of this table is going to be the current position of Y after we shifted it down. The head of the table is going to be this table head that we defined here. And the body is going to be the table body that we defined above. And finally, the theme is going to be plain. And that's just kind of the appearance of the cells of the table, and also like the borders and the colors and things like that. They have some different theming options available, but we're just going to keep it simple and just no borders and just keep it plain. And after we do that, we need to we're going to create that structure of directions and hyperlinks. We have to figure out kind of where our table ended, right? So we shifted the Y down, the value of Y, to pass to the auto table plugin as the starting Y, but we don't actually know exactly how much space that the table took up, because it has a certain number of rows that make up the body, so we don't know exactly where our Y now stands. But luckily, the auto table plugin actually provides us with this value, so we can grab it by now setting Y to be the previous. So if we go to PDF, when we check previous auto table, we can grab the final Y to figure out where that table ended. Super handy. And then we're just going to also add 16 pixels to that amount, and that is now where our Y lies. So it's a nice amount of space below that table. We're just going to set the font size now to be 14, and then we're going to add a new subtitle, and it's going to be called Directions. Again, the X value being the X margin on the left-hand side, and then our current Y value. And so below that, now we want to add just a little instruction about what this section is for. So we're going to shift the Y by 16 pixels. I'm going to set the font size to be a little smaller. So we're going to set the font size to be 11. Then we're going to add some text here. And the instructions will just read, click any of the address hyperlinks below to start directions through Google Maps, colon. And we'll start again at the margin X and at the current Y position. So now we need to define a variable for a space that's kind of a little bit to the right of the X margin. So I'm going to call this section margin X, and we're going to take, it'll set it to margin X plus another like 25 pixels just to move it over a little bit. And now we're going to shift our Y value down by another 20 pixels. I'm going to change the font size to be even a little bit smaller. We're going to change it to 10. And now we're going to loop over each stop in our route, and that will give us the callback with our index and also the current position in the array. So as we loop over each of these, we're going to first of all check if our Y value is, so our current Y value, whatever that may be, if it's beyond the size of a page, meaning it's going from one page to the next, we want to add a new page and continue moving down. So we're gonna we can tell if the Y is greater than that by using JSPDF's internal setting here, grabbing page size and then getting height. So it's going to give us that height in pixels. So if we've gone beyond that, then we want to actually add a page. So they have a handy method here for that called add page. And then we're going to set, since we'll be on a new page, we want to actually set our Y value to be back at margin Y, so at the top of the page that we defined before. So we'll just keep that in mind as we're looping across. And the reason we do this is if you didn't add a page in between, we would continue. So things like the AutoTable plugin handle this for us nicely. If it carries over from one page into another, they will do this sort of adding page step for you. But now we're just adding text on our own because we're going to be creating some hyperlinks. We're going to be adding it manually, so we just need to take care of that ourselves. If we were looping over like a list of strings and we wanted to keep adding them to this page, if we didn't add a page in between, they would kind of continue off of the page, and when we actually go to open our PDF, we wouldn't see the ones that go off of the page. So this adding page step makes sure that we're not actually missing any data. So after we do that, we're going to set the text color to be a default black. So we're going to just do $000, and then we're going to set the text to be, so this is going to be creating, if I just open quickly that file again, so this is creating this section down here. So we don't have enough information here to really make a table, but we're just doing kind of a two-column approach to listing this data. So in the first side, we're going to have kind of the letter associated with the stop, and then we're going to create a hyperlink right next to it. So the way we do this is we're going to first create the letter on the first column. So grabbing the element in our alphabet array from the current position, and we're going to set it to be section margin X. So it's going to be, again, this amount that's just a little bit further away from the margin. And then also the current Y value. And now we're going to create the hyperlink. So we're going to make the hyperlink kind of a blue color. So we're going to set the text color to be $00F. So it's just kind of a default blue. And now we're going to create a hyperlink. So to do this, we use this function on our PDF object called text with link. and we're going to grab the text that we want to display on the hyperlink is going to be just the address string itself. So we're going to take our data array, use the index of the current stop in our route to find which element, and then use the address string property. And then we're going to set the x position of this to be section margin x, but then we remember that we have to move it over some because we have we've used it here, so we're going to move it over a little bit so it shows up next to the letter A like that. So we're going to add on 30 to that, 30 pixels, and then it's going to show up at the current y coordinate, and that's fine because we didn't actually move down yet. We're actually at the same y position, so that's what we want. And the last thing we need to do is provide a set of options to this hyperlink, and really the only one that we're going to be using is the URL. And we want to encode the URL using encode URI, and then we're going to pass in a string with backticks. So the fun part of this is that we're going to be using a Google Maps' URL format, the universal format. So with this style of hyperlink, if you were to say open this on your phone or open it on your computer, it really wouldn't matter. This is a URL that's recognized universally, and it will open in whatever format for the device that you're on. So I can provide a link to this format below, but it essentially goes something like this, and it's going to basically start a set of directions for us based on the location that we're clicking on. So you could imagine if you were, say, if you had this file on your phone and you were stopped and you were wondering where to go next, you could click on the next stop on this PDF. This hyperlink would then open Google Maps for you and set up a new set of directions with the address already pre-populated for you, saving you some time. So we're going to finish this string here, and really the main kind of URL parameter here is this destination, and we're going to, since we're using a template literal here, we're going to put in this address string in the same way that we referenced it here above. And again, we have the, because we're using encode URI here, it's going to be escaped and just put into a format that is URL friendly. And this is happening within a loop. So as we create, so we're kind of creating a row in this two-column format. So once we are done with that, we want to actually shift down our y value. So we're going to add 16 pixels to our y. So the next time it's going to loop around again, and it's going to check, first of all, did we go off the page? If we did, we want to add a page and just set the current y to be at the top margin, and then add the next stop in our route. And really that's it. So we've reached the end of our PDF file. So the last step to make the PDF actually able to be saved in the browser is by calling the save method and then passing in the file name that we want the file to be saved as. So we can save this, and then if we return to our export PDF button here, we just have to pass in our function. So we're going to import it. Oh, okay, yeah, we already have it auto imported at some point. And we're going to pass it in here, export PDF report. If I save that, I can move over to the app here. So I'm just going to open that that sample JSON file. It'll be loaded onto our map. And if I click Export PDF, we see it's saved down here in our browser. I'm going to open that up. And there we have it. This is our route. Fantastic. And so we have that done. Oh, the last thing that we have is just this back button here. We never ended up defining a listener for that, so let's just return to our index.js file, and we're going to select our, let's see, our fields return button. We're going to define the click listener for that. And in here, we're first going to set fields disabled to false, and that's if we return to the import screen. And we want to reset the progress bar as well, because if the geocoding process took place, we just want to make sure it goes back to what it was. And then finally, we just want to call our return to fields section navigation function, which will hide the route section that we're in, and we'll return back to our import step, or sorry, I guess it would be the select field step. All right, well, this is it. This has been a long tutorial. It's kind of a project with a lot of moving parts and little mechanisms that are going on, but I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. Please click like if you want to support us, and also subscribe to Develop Mindfully if you'd like to see more videos like these. If you have any suggestions for any other videos that you'd like to see on different tools or technologies or projects, please drop a comment. They would be greatly appreciated. And until next time, take care and stay mindful.